This is Robert Sapolsky, and you're listening to Father-Offspring Interviews.
Hi, everyone. Welcome back to Father-Offspring Interviews.
Just to jump in before we get started, correction from last week. Last week, I quoted the great evolutionary biologist Burt Bacharach from his song, I'll Never Fall in Love Again. And apparently, I was actually quoting the great evolutionary biologist Hal David, who was the lyricist. Burt Bacharach wrote the melody, which I did not sing.
Well, to start off today's questions, Jakob from Poland says, You've mentioned bipolar disorder a few times, but never type 2. Is the mechanism behind this subtype of the disorder exactly the same? After all, the duration and intensity of the episodes do differ.
Bipolar II. Good. Many episodes ago, we did indeed talk about bipolar disorder, manic depression, not everyday mania, not everyday depression, but as usual, clinical terms that don't even begin to scratch the surface as to how severe the disease is. Bipolar, the manic phase, enormous energy on part of the person, little need for sleep, astonishingly little need for sleep, pressured speech, pressured thought, grandiosity, rush of ideas, delusional thinking to the point that approximately 50% of people with bipolar 1 have a psychosis at some point or other, along with that terrible judgment, terrible decision making, euphoria that crashes into irritability when there's any sort of obstacle thrown in one's path. And of course, all of that oscillating into periods of depression as well, back and forth, bipolar disorder, cycling between the two extremes over the course of months. And what we touched on very briefly were the two biological underpinnings in bipolar. First one seems to be something screwy with circadian clocks. And that's been shown down on a molecular level. Circadian clocks beginning to explain how the person can go for months in a manic stage, then crash into depression, how they can go weeks on 2 hours of sleep a night, circadian stuff. The other main component being an extreme hypersensitivity to reward, generating a delusional, grandiose, often psychotic anticipation, motivation, drive towards often gibberish. It's highly heritable and it's a disaster of a disease. Lurking in the background always is its kid sibling termed bipolar II. And on first pass, what that basically looks like is it's a mild version of bipolar 1, big time bipolar 2. You have a decreased need for sleep. You don't go days without sleeping. You have an increase in energy, not to a amazing dysfunctional extent. Extreme optimism, energy, talkativeness, gregariousness, generativity of ideas. This is sort of the rush that you get from somebody in a bipolar 2 hypomanic phase. That's the term. Full-blown mania in bipolar 1. You've just given away your life savings to some stranger on the street. Bipolar 2, hypomania. You're just full of ideas and full of plans and optimistic and upbeat and hyperverbal and don't need much sleep. Milder version. Milder version, what you see, of course, is bipolar 2 in this case. It has two poles. You also crash into depression. And in general, in bipolar 2, it's more dominated by depression than by the hypomania, which tends to be in contrast to bipolar 1, which is about the stunningly florid mania that accompanies it and the depressive periods in some ways almost exhaustedly dropping into a depression. So bipolar 2, milder version of the manic phase, more manageable and more dominance, more frequent depressive episodes, more severe, longer. Okay, general rule is you can get a bipolar 2 diagnosis if you have had at least one hypomanic period coupled with at least one depression, and if you've never had full blown mania. So the question, of course, becomes what's bipolar II about? Various famous people who've had the diagnosis: Mariah Carey, Carrie Fisher, Demi Lovato. So various people afflicted with it. So you listen to it, and confidence, extroversion, generativity, lots of energy, not much need for sleep, optimism. This sounds kind of good. This sounds kind of productive. This sounds like what I've heard often bipolar II referred to as Silicon Valley bipolar disease. Hyperactive, highly productive, energetic, all of that. And another version in academia, I've heard it referred to as your bipolar CV enhancer. You just get more work done, you publish more papers, you start more companies, and a picture of bipolar II maybe is not so bad. Maybe it's got a lot of advantages. Maybe what we're looking at here is the mild version of bipolar I. Bipolar I destroys your life. Bipolar II, the milder version, can have lots of beneficial effects, lots of productivity. Given that, though, people with bipolar II are still certainly made miserable by these attributes. But this brings us to Jacob's question then. Is bipolar II bipolar I disorder that's not so severe that it destroys your life? Is that the definition of bipolar II? Or framed a different way, is bipolar II a milder genetic version of the genetic disorder that we call bipolar I? As noted, bipolar I is highly heritable. Bipolar II is not quite as heritable, but nonetheless, are you merely looking at a continuum? Which is to say, take people with bipolar I and do a big survey of their genomes and look at all the genes that pop up as being interesting. And if you were then to do the same survey on people with bipolar II, would you get the exact same ensemble of genes implicated? And in the bipolar II case, they're not as active transcriptionally. Would you see a subset of the bipolar I genes being activated in the bipolar II individuals? Would you see only a partial overlap? And what the literature shows is it's a partial overlap. It's a pretty good overlap, enough to say that these are two highly interrelated diseases. One is not merely the low rent version of the other, nonetheless, a lot of genetic overlap. But then you look a little bit more broadly and you get some really interesting insight. Yes, bipolar I does co-vary a lot genetically with bipolar II. Bipolar I almost co-varies as much genetically with schizophrenia. Meanwhile, bipolar II doesn't covary with schizophrenia at all. Amid highly covariant with bipolar I, bipolar II is heavily covariant with depression. So what you're seeing there is they're not the same disease, just on a continuum, but they're closely related. And in some ways, one is more coupled with psychosis, thought disorder, schizophrenia. Two is more coupled with depression. So they're not the same disease, writ large and small, but they're very much related to each other.
All right. Now, a few people, Dana from Lithuania, Colin from Toronto, Tanimola from Kenya, have asked about the chimpanzee civil war happening, summed up by Raghavan from India as deep inside Kabali National Park, one of the world's most peaceful chimp communities has turned into a battlefield. The Ngogo chimps, once bonded by grooming, food, etc., started a civil war. Can you shed some light on this?
Not surprising that we've gotten a huge number of questions about this. This was all over the news about a month ago. This bloody, violent, fatal civil war going on in a population of chimps. Kabali Forest, which is in western Uganda, a population of chimps in there, the Ngogo chimp population. And what we start off with is looking at chimp aggression. Chimps are incredibly aggressive animals. They are terrifyingly so. They are unbelievably strong. They've got massive canines. Every time a chimp turns on their human, when you've got something really, really imprudent, like a human keeping a chimp as a pet, somehow before it's over with, the chimp is bitten off the person's face, taken off a limb, bitten off their genitals. Chimps are wildly aggressive, and chimps out in the wild are, on occasion, wildly aggressive in the exact same way with each other. Now, chimp violence was part of redefining who humans were some decades back with Goodall. Ooh, we are the only species who murders. No, it turns out all sorts of other species do infanticide. We've talked about in strategic ways in which it can enhance a male's reproductive success to kill the infants of some rival guys. Okay, so we're not the only species that commits murder. We're the only species that commits murder in an organized way. Nah. And that's where chimps showed that we were wrong in that regard. And this was Goodall's work beginning to show chimps, a number of males, would form a patrol, a border patrol, the border of their territory, where if they encountered a chimp from another group, they would attack him, they might kill him, organized, in a sense, premeditated violence going on there. We're not the only species that did that. Ha, that's interesting. You see baboons, for example, having hugely aggressive lives among the males within a troop. You don't see border patrols and jumping on some guy from a different troop. What's the difference? There's a very clear explanation. Among baboons, males pick up at puberty and move to a different troop. So all the adult males in a baboon troop grew up someplace else. They're not related to each other. And in fact, their kid brother may be in the troop across the river there, the folks next door. What you are all about as a competitive male baboon is competing with the other guys in your group because they are not your lifelong friends, cousins, or siblings. Male violence is within group. On the other hand, among chimps, male chimps stay in their home troop their whole life. It's the females who leave. So you've got a chimp group, has a bunch of males in there who are brothers and cousins, or even if they're not related, they've been dealing with each other their whole lives. And the folks across the valley, those are not relatives. Those are not just like us, those are thems. Thus, you've got the building blocks of chimp male aggression being between groups and cooperating males within a group beginning to form this organized violence. Now, immediately a problem comes up with that. Okay, that explains everything why within group aggression is high in baboons, but not between groups. Between group aggression and chimps is what this whole story is about. Within group, not as much. Bonobos, the close relatives of chimps and close relatives of ours, bonobos who have this wonderful, peaceful lifestyle, and they've got the same structure as chimps, which is to say, all the adult males in the bonobo group have been there their whole lives, brothers and cousins, and this could make for this wonderfully cooperative band of brothers raiding the folks next door. But you don't see aggression like that. The role of females in bonobo societies is very different. Females who grew up elsewhere and migrate in, nonetheless, are cooperative enough to enforce some sort of peace in our time among the males in bonobo groups. Okay, so that's our backdrop on male chimp aggression, which brings us to this latest paper, which was published to much acclaim, worldwide coverage in Science last month. A large international team of primatologists, but primarily led by Aaron Sandell at University of Texas at Austin, David Watts at Yale, and John Matani at University of Michigan. And John Matani had played an interesting prior role in organized chimp violence. He had documented, again, in the same field site some years ago, the males from one group systematically attacking the males in another group to the point of eradicating them. And oh, so human of an outcome after that. the victorious male chimps expanding their territory. So this is terrain that he's been following for a long time. So this chimp population, a group of about 200 individuals, 30 years of almost continuous observational data on them. And out of that came this civil war, this seeming civil war, this unprecedented level of sustained violence between two chimp groups. Okay, so this group, originally a fairly cohesive group of about 200 individuals, that is a gigantic group of chimps. And what often begins after a while is it begins to break into factions, not factions in any sort of seceding from the union kind of way, but just these guys tend to hang out with each other there. These guys like those fruiting trees, say they go that direction in the morning. And in the late 1990s, this group began to kind of cluster into two subgroups that did most of their days foraging separate from each other, much of their grooming, much of their socializing. But this was still a group that came together at the end of each day and slept in the same place and was a cohesive group. And over the subsequent years, what you saw was more and more of a divide occurring between the two, such that by 2015, you were beginning to get things like 2015 was the last year that a male from what would eventually become this separate faction mated with a female from what would eventually become that separate faction. Between factions, between communities mating, they were beginning to divide pretty dramatically here. And it was right around that point that you started seeing the first aggression between males of these two groups, termed the Western chimp community and the Central one. And you began to see violence between them. The strangest thing is the Western community was much smaller than the Central one. The Western community is the one that then started going about eradicating males from the Central community, killing males repeatedly over the course of months, over years, and enormously unprecedented in that regard. You would see border patrols, high levels of them between chimps of the two groups going along the edge of their territories to make sure that the other side wasn't sneaking up on them. You saw this escalating, and over this time, between 2015 and 2018, more and more of a split and more violence. And by 2018, you saw essentially these were now two completely separate groups. They didn't sleep in the same place, they didn't interact with each other, and there was this lethal violence of Western group males against Central group males, killing them. 7 observed documented killings during that time. Additional ones, you hear a whole bunch of chimps screaming their heads off in the forest, and you get over there half an hour later and you find one of the guys dead there, torn to shreds. That's pretty good evidence that that's been another killing. Then around 2018, it took an additional turn, which was males from the Western population now started also targeting infants in the Central population. And soon, in addition to the 7 documented killing of males, and probably twice that number where there's pretty good inferential evidence, there were 17, 18 infants being killed as well. And in the years after that, as this continued, an average of 1 male was being killed a year and 2 infants a year. And this was an extraordinarily high level of violence. No one had ever seen anything like this before. And here's a measure of what it looks like. Here in this first picture, you see these 4 chimps, and is labeled there. One of them in 2015 is destined to be a member of the Central troop, and the other 3 destined to be in the Western troop. They're still part of one troop there, and they're doing this very affiliative thing. They're all hugging each other before they're off to do some border patrol or marauding or shoplifting or who knows what. But very, very affiliative, good old buddies. And in the next picture, 2019, you see that same Central group male surrounded by the same 3 Western group males who were in the process of murdering him. So this was the drama of this. I don't know if this counts as a civil war, but the most dramatic example of animals that used to coexist, something happened and enormous amounts of violence, enormous amounts of organized killing. And when you look at all the different field sites in which chimps have been studied and how long, and you do calculations, what the authors came up with was an estimate that you would see something like this once every 500 years or so. So this was a pretty rare event. So, of course, at this point, the question becomes, what happened? What triggered this civil war between chimps who formerly lived together since time immemorial, were part of the same group, hunted together, did border patrols together, groomed together, sang songs together, and now instead murdering a chimp who 3, 4 years earlier you were hanging out with and doing affiliative stuff with. What are the causes of this? At this point, they don't know, but there's all sorts of explanations that could be offered. First one, resource competition. Maybe during this time there was a drought, the forest was losing food that the chimps would normally go after. There were food shortages. There was more extreme competition. Maybe that's what it was about. There was precedent for this in that there was one prior case almost 50 years ago with Jane Goodall's chimps in Tanzania, where a large group split in two and eventually saw violence between males of the two groups. What was going on there? Famously, notoriously, Goodall was provisioning them, was feeding them, and this makes primates crazily competitive and violent. And a whole bunch of that aggression was pretty clearly attributable to here's a bunch of bananas, go for it, guys. The provisioning played a huge role. In the years since, Matani and Richard Wrangham, a very renowned primatologist at Harvard, have shown all the examples of chimp violence across all the different study sites are not explainable by proximity to humans and their food. And that wasn't the case in this situation either. This was a very, very plentiful ecosystem. So this was not an issue of suddenly they were all murderously competing for food. Next possibility, one thing that occurred right around the time that the split was getting really bloody was the last alpha male over both factions there got toppled and replaced by a different alpha male. Does this have something to do with this? Is this like the Catholics and the Protestants in Northern Ireland power sharing, except something goes wrong with it? Was it a central chimp who was knocked out and now there's supposed to be a Western one? No evidence for that. The chimp who was knocked out of the alpha position came from the central population. The chimp who replaced him came from the central as well. No obvious evidence that that had something to do with it. Next possibility, something very interesting about the spatial relations between the two groups. Now, what we saw in this figure before was a demonstration that over the years, the two groups socially completely fissioned to the point where they were sleeping in different places. They were not interacting socially, affiliatively at all. Yet what you see in the figure underneath that is over that time, their territories started to separate, but not completely. There were still overlapping territories between the two groups. And this brings up a really interesting issue in the relationship between geography and human violence. Wonderful study done some years ago looking at a theoretical model. Okay, you've got two populations, and they've got the potential for intergroup violence. And what's the spatial relationship between the two populations? And as set up in the simulation study, it was 50% of the people from this group, 50% from the other. Three possible arrangements. One would be everybody from this group was on this side of a border, everybody from that group on the other side. Second possible arrangement kind of overlaps little islands of one of the groups inside the other one overlap. Third way, as much intermixing as possible so that it looked like a checkerboard, one individual from each group in their checkerboard square there as maximally distributed. And what they showed with this theoretical model was if you have everybody in this side and everybody on that side, you get the least violence that way. How come? Because the border between them is the shortest it could possibly be if it's everybody versus everybody. Your average individuals far from the borders, these folks never encounter anybody from the other group. Prediction, not a whole lot of violence would emerge from there. At the other extreme, the checkerboard version, the prediction is you don't see a whole lot of violence because every individual in their own checkerboard square is surrounded on four sides by someone from the other group. They never have the colleagues, the coalitional partners to back them up. That's another scenario where the prediction would be very low levels of aggression, violence. Where you got the most was in between, where you had partial overlap, where you had a lot of boundaries between the two groups, but where within each subgroup it was not an isolated individual, but groups inside that could at least be aggressive in a cooperative, organized way, showing that's the spatial orientation that's most likely to generate violence. And the plum in the pudding, the top of the frosting, the greatest thing in that study was they then used this theoretical model that they had generated and they applied it to the Balkans during the Balkan Wars in the 1990s, looking at degree of intermixing of Serbian and Bosnian populations. And from that, they were predicting what levels of violence would be in these particular areas. And it was a remarkably good match. Places where there was a mountain range between the Bosnians and the Serbs, or one single river of a border, you were not getting a whole lot of violence. Big cities where the intermixing was dramatic, you were not, it was where you were getting pockets of one group inside the other group. And that's essentially what this picture here of the overlap of territories is about. It's not one border that is facing the two sides there, completely non-overlapping. It's not massive intermixing. This is kind of the picture that that study suggested was going to produce the most tension, the most encounters between someone in this group and a number of individuals from that group, most likely to set that up. So that was the spatial geographical possibility for explaining it. So now turning to the next possibility, does a chimp make history or does history make the chimp? Endless perpetual debates about pivotal roles of individual humans in history, often framed as identifying circumstances where if something different had happened to one individual, a world of changes would have happened if Gandhi had not been assassinated. Perhaps all of the appalling violence and bloodshed that went on during the births of India and Pakistan might not have occurred. That as a what if, all pivoting around the death of one individual. Another example, 1850s, Zachary Taylor was president of the United States, and he died in office, only the second person to do it after last week's Henry Harrison. And Zachary Taylor, he died of a stomach flu, died in office and was succeeded by his profoundly obscure vice president, Millard Fillmore. And that's where the little glitch in the road came in. Zachary Taylor was basically opposed to slavery and was opposed to slavery being legal in new colonies as they formed. On the other hand, Millard Fillmore made noises about how he personally wasn't thrilled about slavery, but he wanted to appease the southern states, and he signed a Fugitive Slave Act bill, which allowed people to return captured slaves back to the South again over great Northern abolitionist objections and such. And basically, if Taylor had stayed in office, there's a good chance he would have had enough of a firm grasp on the South that the Civil War would never have happened. Another example of this one I love just for the name of one of the principles in it, 229 BC, the Second Punic War between Carthage and Rome. And what went on there was the Carthaginian general drowned or something. And the new person in charge, who was called Hasrubal the Fair, Hasrubal the Fair took over. And Hasrubal the Fair appears to have been like a pretty good guy diplomat. He was intent on diplomatic solutions to whatever territorial nonsense was generating the war there. And he was all set for negotiating stuff with Rome. And then he was assassinated. Bizarre detail, a king, a Celtic king, sent one of his slaves all the way down to North Africa to assassinate Hasrubal the Fair, and in the aftermath, the army was taken over by Hannibal, not Hannibal Lecter, but Hannibal, the great Hannibal of the elephants, and great bloodshed ensued. Incidentally, I was curious. I got pulled to this irresistibly. Hasdrubal the Fair. Oh my God, what a great historical name, this diplomat, this peace bringer. And it turns out another translation of his name was Hasdrubal the Handsome. He was fair. He was good looking. So he was Haspel the good looking and got assassinated. Okay, nonetheless, these are all examples where if something had not happened to one pivotal individual, there might have been a very different outcome. And what is also shown in the study was not one individual, but there were a small number of male chimps who were bridges between the two communities. As they were coming further apart, they were ones who were still interacting regularly with individuals of both groups, good affiliative relationships, and on a certain level, they were kind of holding things together. And it just so happened there was some disease outbreak and the bridging males died. If they hadn't died, maybe none of this would have occurred. Now, one final possibility is something that takes us back to all our sociobiology stuff, cooperation among relatives and passing on copies of genes. When the troops split in two, was it random in terms of degrees of relatedness? And what the authors showed is that most of the brother pairs, same mother, wound up in the same faction. The same father pairs of brothers pretty much didn't know that they were brothers. They wound up in different factions. And in at least two cases, you had same mother pair of brothers where they split up, a la the heartbreak of American Civil War, brother against brother, where they wound up in different factions. Nonetheless, there was at least enough clustering of relatives in the two different groups that I think this was part of what was going on as well. Okay, so what's the main thing to make of this? And this is what the authors emphasized at the end. Human violence, human organized violence, what it's built around, inevitably around religion, around ethnicity, around ideology, human warfare as being driven by ideas, by abstract group membership stuff. And what we see here is it's no religion, no ethnicity, no ideology. Some of them were not neo Marxists and the other ones were Keynesians or some such thing. What you see is simply by social dynamics, you can get a bloody, violent period that sure looks like humans at their worst, taking advantage of the thems on the other side of the valley.
And that's all for today. I'm Offspring Sapolsky, and thanks for your continued support of science and the beard.